You know how sometimes you get that feeling like you're being watched? That prickly sensation on the back of your neck that makes you turn around even when you know nobody's there? Well, I'm here to tell you that sometimes that feeling is dead right. And sometimes what's watching you is something you really don't want to see. I should probably start from the beginning. I've been hunting these mountains for over 20 years, ever since I was a kid tagging along with my old man. Know every ridge, every valley, every game trail worth knowing. These aren't your tourist mountains either. We're talking about deep wilderness, the kind of place where cell phones don't work, and the nearest road is a 2-hour hike through thick forest. Last fall, something started tearing up campsites in the area, not just scattered gear or eaten food. I'm talking about tents ripped to shreds, coolers crushed like tin cans, and trees with claw marks 8 feet off the ground. The local rangers figured it was either a really aggressive black bear or maybe a mountain lion, but the damage didn't look right for either one. Bears are messy, but they're not usually that destructive, and mountain lions are sneaky. They don't trash campsites like they're having a tantrum. I'd been finding weird tracks too. Started noticing them about a month before I set up my first camera. They showed up on muddy sections of trail after heavy rains, always in spots where the ground was soft enough to hold a print. At first glance, they looked almost like bear tracks, but something was off. They were too long, too narrow, and they showed up in a pattern that suggested whatever made them was walking on 2 legs, not 4. The prints were massive, had to be at least 16 inches long and maybe 6 inches wide at the heel. I've seen plenty of bear prints in my time, and even the biggest black bear doesn't leave tracks that size. Plus, bears don't walk in straight lines the way these prints did. Whatever was making them had a stride longer than any person I knew, covering ground in steps that would have had me jogging to match. Then there were the claw marks. Found them on trees near the damaged campsites, always on the same type of tree, mature pines with thick bark. The marks ran vertically down the trunk, starting about 8 feet up and running down to shoulder height. They weren't the random scratches you'd see from a bear marking territory. These looked deliberate, like something was testing its claws or maybe just showing off how high it could reach. One morning in early October, I was checking one of my regular hunting spots when I found a set of those tracks leading right up to a natural clearing I'd been watching for years. The clearing sits in a little bowl between 2 ridges, maybe 50 yards across, with a small cave visible at the far end where the hillside gets steep. I'd always liked the spot because deer would come through to browse, and it gave me a good view of the surrounding area. But that morning, the clearing felt different. The usual bird sounds were missing, and the squirrels that normally chattered from the oak trees were nowhere to be seen. Even the insects seemed quieter than normal. It was like everything in the forest was holding its breath. That's when I decided to set up a trail camera. I'd been using trail cameras for years to scout game patterns, nothing fancy, just a basic model that could capture decent photos and short videos when something triggered the motion sensor. Figured I'd finally get some answers about what was causing all the damage in the area. Maybe catch footage of a bear I'd never seen before, or confirm it was a mountain lion moving through. I picked a spot about 20 yards from the edge of the clearing, mounting the camera on a pine tree thick enough to hold it steady. The angle gave me a clear view of the open area and the mouth of that little cave. Made sure the camera was positioned high enough that a curious deer wouldn't knock it over, but low enough to catch anything walking through at ground level. The setting felt right, remote enough that I wouldn't have to worry about hikers or other hunters stumbling across my camera, but positioned along what looked like a natural travel route for wildlife. The tracks I'd been following led directly through this clearing, and I could see game trails converging from 3 different directions. After setting up the camera, I marked the date and time in my hunting journal, October 8th, around 3 in the afternoon. The plan was simple: let the camera run for a week, then come back to check what it had captured. I'd done this routine dozens of times before, usually ending up with photos of deer, the occasional turkey, and maybe a raccoon or two. Walking back to my truck, I had that weird feeling again, like something was watching me leave. I stopped a couple times and looked back, but the forest was quiet, just trees and shadows, and the normal sounds of wind through the leaves. Still, I couldn't shake the sensation that I wasn't alone out there. The week seemed to drag by slower than usual. I kept thinking about that camera, wondering what it might be recording. Part of me expected to find nothing more interesting than the usual deer photos, but another part of me, the part that had seen those massive tracks and claw marks, was hoping for something that would finally explain what was happening in those mountains. October 15th came around, and I made the hike back to the clearing. The camera was still right where I'd left it, no signs that anything had messed with it. The little LED light was still blinking, showing the battery was good and the unit was functioning normally. I pulled the memory card and headed home, eager to see what the week had brought. Loading the images onto my computer that night, I started scrolling through the usual stuff. Several photos of deer moving through at dawn and dusk, a few shots of squirrels, and one blurry image of what might have been a fox. Nothing unusual for the first 5 days. Then I got to the images from the 6th night. The timestamp showed 2:47 a.m. when the camera first triggered. The initial photo was dark, just the clearing lit up by the camera's flash, but something large was moving at the edge of the frame. The second photo, taken 3 seconds later, showed it more clearly. Whatever it wasn't a bear. The figure stood upright, definitely bipedal, and taller than any person I'd ever seen. The body shape was wrong for a human though, too broad across the shoulders, too thick through the torso. The entire figure was dark, covered in what looked like dense fur or hair, and it appeared to be moving across the clearing with a purposeful stride. But the most unsettling thing was the third photo. The creature had moved closer to the camera, close enough that I could make out more details. It wasn't just passing through the area randomly, it was looking directly at the camera. The flash had reflected off 2 eyes, giving them an eerie glow, and the way the head was positioned suggested it had noticed the camera and was investigating it. The fourth and final photo from that sequence showed empty clearing again. Whatever it was had moved on, but not before taking a long look at my equipment. I stared at those images for hours that night, zooming in, adjusting the brightness and contrast, trying to convince myself I was seeing something normal. Maybe it was just a bear standing up to get a better look around. Maybe the angle and lighting were playing tricks, making something ordinary look strange. But the more I looked, the more convinced I became that I'd captured something I couldn't explain. The proportions were all wrong for a bear, and bears don't typically stand upright and walk across clearings like they're out for a casual stroll. The stride length visible between photos suggested something with much longer legs than any bear I'd ever seen. That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about those eyes looking directly at the camera and wondering what kind of intelligence was behind them. Most animals that trigger trail cameras either ignore the equipment completely or get spooked by the flash and run off. This thing had been curious enough to approach and examine the camera. By morning, I'd made up my mind. I needed better footage, more angles, and clearer images. If something that unusual was moving through the area regularly, I wanted to document it properly. I spent the next day gathering equipment. I had 3 more trail cameras in my gear collection, older models, but still functional. I also picked up extra batteries, memory cards, and a bottle of scent killer to mask my smell while setting up the equipment. If I was going to do this, I wanted to do it right. The plan was to set up the cameras in a triangle formation around the original spot, creating overlapping fields of view that would give me multiple angles of anything moving through the area. I'd position one camera near the mouth of the cave, another on the opposite side of the clearing, and keep the original camera where it was. With 3 different viewpoints, I'd be able to track movement patterns and get much clearer documentation. 2 days later, I hiked back into the area with my expanded camera setup. The morning was crisp and clear, perfect weather for a long hike through the forest. But as soon as I reached the clearing, something felt different. The forest was too quiet again, just like it had been when I first found those tracks. No bird calls, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush, no insects buzzing around. The silence felt heavy, almost oppressive, and I found myself moving more carefully than usual. Setting up the first additional camera took longer than expected. I wanted to position it perfectly to capture anything approaching the cave entrance, but finding the right tree with a clear line of sight took some trial and error. While I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being observed. Every few minutes, I'd stop what I was doing and scan the tree line around the clearing. Never saw anything obvious, but the sensation persisted. It was like that itch between your shoulder blades that you can't quite reach, except this was an itch in my brain telling me something was paying attention to my activities. The second camera went up on the far side of the clearing, angled to capture anything moving along the main game trail. This position would give me a side view of whatever passed through, complementing the front-facing angle of the original camera. With all 3 cameras running, I'd have a comprehensive surveillance setup covering most of the clearing and the approaches to it. It was while setting up the 3rd camera that I found the first footprint. I was looking for the right mounting spot when I noticed the ground near a large oak tree was softer than the surrounding area. A small depression in the earth had collected moisture from the recent rains, creating a perfect medium for preserving tracks. And right there, clear as day, was one of those massive prints I'd been seeing around the damaged campsites. This one was even clearer than the others, showing individual toe impressions and what looked like the texture of skin or a thick callus across the heel and ball of the foot. The print was fresh too. Couldn't have been more than a day or 2 old based on how sharp the edges were. But what really got my attention was the location. The footprint was positioned right next to where I'd been working, close enough that whoever or whatever made it could have reached out and touched me while I was mounting the camera. The thought sent a chill down my spine. I started looking around more carefully and found 2 more prints, both leading away from the oak tree toward the cave entrance. Whatever had been there had been watching me work, then moved off in the direction of the cave when I finished. The realization hit me that I might not be alone in the forest right now. Something could be watching me at this very moment, staying hidden in the thick forest around the clearing while I went about setting up my cameras. The idea was both terrifying and fascinating. I finished the camera setup as quickly as possible, double-checking that each unit was properly mounted and functioning. All 3 cameras showed solid battery levels and clear memory card indicators. The coverage looked good. Anything moving through the clearing or approaching the cave would trigger at least 1 camera, and probably 2 or 3. Walking back to the truck, I kept looking over my shoulder. The feeling of being watched was stronger than ever, and I found myself hurrying more than usual. Several times, I thought I heard something moving parallel to my path through the trees, staying just out of sight but matching my pace. At one point, I stopped completely and listened. For about 10 seconds, everything was silent. Then I heard what sounded like a large branch snapping somewhere behind me, followed by the rustle of something moving through thick underbrush. When I turned around, I couldn't see anything, but the forest in that direction had gone completely quiet. I didn't run back to the truck, but I definitely walked faster than normal. That night, I couldn't concentrate on anything. I kept thinking about that fresh footprint right next to where I'd been working and wondering how long something had been watching me set up the cameras. The idea that I'd been observed the whole time, maybe from just a few dozen yards away, was deeply unsettling. 3 days later, I decided to check the cameras early. The original plan had been to wait a full week, but curiosity got the better of me. I wanted to see what the new setup had captured and whether the creature from the first footage had returned. The hike back to the clearing was uneventful, at least until I got close to the camera locations. That's when I realized something was wrong. The first camera I checked, the one I'd mounted near the cave entrance, was gone. Not knocked down by a falling branch or damaged by weather. Gone. The mounting strap had been cut or broken, and the camera had been removed completely. I searched the area around the tree for 20 minutes, but couldn't find any trace of it. The second additional camera, the one positioned on the far side of the clearing, was still in place, but had been moved. Someone or something had changed its angle so that instead of pointing toward the center of the clearing, it was now aimed back toward the main trail, the direction I always approach from. The camera was still functional, still mounted securely, but it was now positioned to watch the trail rather than the clearing. The original camera was still in its original position, but when I got close to examine it, I could see fingerprints on the lens housing. Not human fingerprints. These were much larger, and the pattern was different. It looked like something with much bigger hands had picked up the camera and examined it closely before putting it back in place. Walking around the clearing, I found fresh footprints everywhere. The recent rains had left the ground soft, and the tracks were clear and numerous. Whatever had been here had spent significant time moving around the area, approaching each camera location, and apparently studying the equipment. The most disturbing discovery was a set of prints that formed a complete circle around the clearing, staying just inside the tree line. Something had walked completely around the area, probably while I wasn't there, checking each camera position from multiple angles. The track suggested a methodical, almost systematic approach to investigating my surveillance setup. It was clear that whatever I was dealing with was much more intelligent than I'd initially thought. This wasn't just a large animal triggering cameras as it passed through. This was something that understood what the cameras were for and had deliberately interfered with my monitoring setup. The realization that the creature had not only found my cameras, but had actively moved them and stolen one was profoundly unsettling. It suggested a level of intelligence and awareness that made me question everything I thought I knew about what was living in these mountains. Standing in that clearing, surrounded by evidence that something had been systematically examining my equipment, I felt more vulnerable than I ever had in the forest. Whatever was out there knew I was watching it, and it was watching me back. The thought that it might be observing me at that very moment, staying hidden in the thick forest around the clearing, made me want to get back to my truck as quickly as possible. I retrieved the memory card from the original camera and left the area, moving faster than I normally would on the trail back to the parking area. Several times I thought I heard movement keeping pace with me through the trees, but I never saw anything definitive. That evening, I loaded the memory card and discovered that my fears were justified. The camera had captured extensive footage of the creature examining the equipment and moving around the clearing. The images were clearer than the first batch, showing more detail of what I was dealing with. The creature was definitely bipedal, definitely intelligent, and definitely much larger than any known animal in the region. The footage showed it approaching each camera location, spending several minutes examining each setup, and in one particularly clear image, looking directly into the original camera lens from just a few feet away. What struck me most was the deliberate nature of its actions. This wasn't random behavior. The creature had methodically investigated each camera, figured out how to move them, and removed one completely. The intelligence displayed in the footage was unmistakable and deeply unsettling. But the most disturbing image was the final one captured before I arrived to check the cameras. The timestamp showed it was taken just 2 hours before I reached the clearing. The creature was standing at the edge of the clearing, partially hidden behind a large pine tree, and appeared to be watching the trail I would be approaching on. It had been waiting for me. That night, I barely slept. Every sound outside my house, wind in the trees, a car driving by, the settling of the old wooden frame made me jump. I kept thinking about that final image, the way the creature had been positioned to observe my approach to the clearing. Had it seen me coming and moved away, or had it stayed hidden and watched me the whole time I was there? The next morning, I decided I needed to take a different approach. The creature obviously knew about the cameras now and had demonstrated that it could interfere with them at will. But I still needed answers. I needed to know what I was dealing with and whether it posed any real threat. Against every instinct screaming at me to stay away, I decided to spend a night in the forest near the clearing. If the creature was as intelligent as it appeared to be, maybe I could observe its behavior directly rather than relying on trail cameras that it could easily avoid or manipulate. I spent the afternoon preparing for an overnight camping trip. I packed light, just a small tent, sleeping bag, basic food, and water for one night. I also brought a powerful flashlight and my hunting rifle, though I hoped I wouldn't need either one. The plan was to set up camp about 200 yards from the clearing in a spot that would give me a clear view of the area while keeping me out of the immediate vicinity. The hike back to the area that evening felt different from all my previous trips. The forest seemed more alive somehow, full of small sounds and movements that I'd never noticed before. Every rustle in the underbrush, every crack of a twig, every call from a bird made me more aware of how much activity was normally happening around me. I found a good camping spot on a small ridge overlooking the clearing. The position gave me a clear line of sight to the cave entrance and most of the open area, while keeping me elevated and partially concealed behind some large boulders. I set up my tent quickly and settled in to wait. The sun set around 7:30 and full darkness fell about an hour later. I positioned myself outside the tent with my back against one of the boulders, rifle across my knees, and started my vigil. The night was clear and cool, with enough starlight to make out general shapes and movement in the clearing below. For the first couple of hours, everything was normal. I heard the usual night sounds, owls calling, small animals moving through the underbrush, the distant cry of a coyote somewhere deeper in the mountains. The clearing remained empty and still. Around 10:30, things started to change. The normal night sounds began to fade away, just like I'd experienced during my daytime visits to the area. Within the span of about 15 minutes, the forest became almost completely silent. No owl calls, no rustling in the brush, no insect sounds. The quiet was so complete it felt unnatural. That's when I heard the footsteps. They started somewhere to my left, moving slowly through the forest in the direction of the clearing. The sound was unmistakable. Something large walking on two legs, placing each foot deliberately and carefully. The steps were too heavy and too far apart to be human, and they had a rhythm that was almost hypnotic. I strained to see movement in the darkness below, but the creature stayed hidden in the tree line around the clearing. For almost an hour, I could hear it moving around the perimeter of the open area, sometimes stopping for long periods, sometimes moving a few steps before stopping again. It was like it was surveying the area, checking for any changes since its last visit. Around midnight, the footsteps stopped completely. The forest remained silent for another 30 minutes, and I began to think whatever had been down there had moved on. I was wrong. The first indication that I was no longer alone on the ridge was the sound of something large moving through the trees directly behind my camping spot. Not the careful, measured footsteps I'd been hearing in the clearing, but faster movement through thick brush, like something was approaching my position from a different direction. I turned around slowly, trying not to make any sudden movements that might attract attention. The forest behind me was completely dark. and I couldn't make out any specific shapes or movement. But I could hear something out there, staying just beyond the range of my vision. Then I heard footsteps on my left side, moving parallel to the ridge, and more movement on my right side. The realization hit me that there wasn't just one creature out there. Multiple somethings were moving around my camping spot, staying hidden in the darkness, but making no effort to conceal the sounds of their movement. The feeling of being surrounded was overwhelming. I had positioned myself on the ridge, thinking it would give me a tactical advantage, a clear view of the area I wanted to watch. Instead, I'd put myself in a spot where I could be approached from multiple directions without any warning. For the next 2 hours, I sat motionless against the boulder, listening to movement all around my position. Sometimes the sounds would fade away completely, making me think they'd moved on. Then I'd hear a branch snap or the rustle of something moving through brush, and I'd realize they were still out there. The most unsettling part was how intelligent their movement seemed. They never came close enough for me to see them clearly, but they were obviously aware of my location. Several times, I heard what sounded like soft vocalizations. Not quite howls or roars, but low, rumbling sounds that seemed to be some form of communication. Around 3 a.m, everything went quiet again. The sudden absence of movement was almost as unnerving as the sounds had been. I waited another hour before finally allowing myself to relax slightly, thinking they might have finally moved on. I was wrong about that too. Just before dawn, I dozed off for a few minutes while leaning against the boulder. I woke up when I heard my tent zipper being opened. The sound was unmistakable, the specific metallic rasp of a zipper being pulled slowly down. I opened my eyes and looked toward my tent, which was positioned about 10 feet to my right. In the dim pre-dawn light, I could see a large, dark shape crouched next to the tent entrance, working the zipper with what appeared to be remarkable dexterity. I held my breath and remained completely motionless, not wanting to attract the attention of whatever was investigating my camping gear. The creature spent several minutes examining the inside of my tent, moving things around carefully and quietly. At one point, it pulled out my sleeping bag and seemed to be examining the material closely. When it finished with the tent, the creature moved over to my backpack, which I'd left on the ground near my camping spot. Again, it spent several minutes going through the contents, removing items and examining them before putting them back. The level of curiosity and intelligence displayed was remarkable and terrifying. Throughout this entire investigation, the creature remained just at the edge of my vision. I could see its general shape and size, definitely much larger than a human covered in dark fur or hair. But I couldn't make out specific details of its appearance. It moved with a fluid grace that suggested great physical strength and coordination. The most unnerving aspect was how quietly it moved. Despite its obvious size, it made almost no sound as it examined my equipment. The only noise was the occasional soft rustle of nylon as it moved items around and the metallic sound of the tent zipper. After about 20 minutes, the creature seemed to lose interest in my camping gear. It moved away from my campsite, heading back toward the tree line, and I lost sight of it in the growing dawn light. I remained motionless for another hour, listening for any indication that it or others might still be in the area. As full daylight arrived, I finally felt safe enough to move around and assess the situation. Examining my tent and backpack, I was amazed by how carefully everything had been handled. Nothing was damaged or destroyed. Items had been moved around and examined, but everything had been put back more or less where it belonged. The creature had shown remarkable restraint and curiosity rather than aggression. It could easily have damaged my equipment or worse, but instead it had conducted what seemed like a careful investigation of my presence in its territory. Looking around the camping area in daylight, I found evidence that my nighttime visitors had been even more numerous than I'd realized. Footprints were everywhere, around my tent, near my backpack, and in a wide circle around the entire camping spot. The prints showed at least 3 different individuals, all of enormous size. But the most disturbing discovery was a set of handprints on the side of my truck. I'd parked about a quarter-mile away from my camping spot, thinking the distance would keep the vehicle away from whatever activity might occur near the clearing. The handprints were clearly visible on the driver's side door and window, much larger than human hands and showing the distinctive pattern I'd seen on my trail camera. Whatever had visited my campsite had also found my truck and examined it thoroughly. The prints suggested they'd tested the door handles and looked through the windows, probably trying to understand what the vehicle was and whether it posed any threat. The realization that they'd located and investigated my truck meant they'd been tracking me much more comprehensively than I'd understood. They knew where I'd come from, where I'd camped, and how I planned to leave the area. The level of intelligence and organization required for that kind of surveillance was deeply unsettling. Standing next to my truck that morning, looking at those massive handprints on the door, I felt more vulnerable and exposed than I'd ever felt in my life. These creatures weren't just randomly moving through their territory anymore. They were actively studying me, learning about my equipment and habits, and demonstrating a level of intelligence that made them genuinely dangerous. I loaded my gear quickly and headed home, eager to get away from an area where I was clearly outmatched and out of my depth. But the experience had changed something fundamental about my relationship with those mountains. I could no longer think of them as empty wilderness that I understood and could navigate safely. They were home to something I didn't understand, something that was now very much aware of my presence. That evening, I did something I'd never done before. I researched what I'd experienced online. I'd always been skeptical of stories about unknown creatures in the wilderness, dismissing them as the products of overactive imaginations or deliberate hoaxes. But after what I'd witnessed, I was willing to consider possibilities I'd never entertained before. What I found was both reassuring and troubling. There were hundreds of similar reports from wilderness areas across North America, many describing encounters with large, intelligent, bipedal creatures that showed remarkable curiosity about human activities. The consistency of the descriptions across different regions and time periods was striking. But what worried me most were the reports of increasingly bold behavior. Many of the more recent accounts described creatures that were no longer content to remain hidden. They were approaching campsites, examining equipment, and in some cases, actively tracking and observing human visitors to their territories. I began to wonder if my own activities, setting up trail cameras, camping overnight, repeatedly visiting the same area, had inadvertently triggered an escalation in their interest and awareness. Maybe I'd crossed some invisible line that marked the difference between being tolerated and being seen as a threat or intrusion. Over the following weeks, I tried to stay away from that area of the mountains. I found other places to hunt, other trails to hike, other clearings to set up cameras in. But I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd experienced and what it might mean. The problem was that avoiding the area didn't seem to be enough. I started noticing signs that my nighttime visitors might not have been content to remain in their remote mountain territory. Small things at first, footprints in the soft earth around my house after heavy rains, the sense of being watched when I was in my yard after dark, subtle disturbances to my outdoor equipment that suggested someone or something had been examining it. The first definitive proof came about a month after my camping experience. I woke up one morning to find handprints on my bedroom window. The same large, distinctive prints I'd found on my truck and trail camera. The prints were on the outside of the glass, positioned at a height that would have required something at least 8 feet tall to make them. The realization that one or more of these creatures had approached my house during the night and looked through my bedroom window was terrifying beyond description. The safety and security of my own home had been compromised by something I didn't understand and couldn't predict. That day, I made a decision that went against every instinct I had as a hunter and outdoorsman. I was going to end my involvement with whatever was happening in those mountains. No more trail cameras, no more camping trips, no more attempts to document or understand what I'd encountered. I was going to pack up my equipment, avoid those areas completely, and hope that my withdrawal would satisfy whatever intelligence was behind the escalating contact. But it seemed like the decision might be too late. 2 days after finding the handprints on my window, I received what I can only describe as a final warning. I came home from work to find something waiting for me in my driveway. The trail camera that had been stolen from the clearing, placed carefully on the hood of my truck. The camera appeared to be undamaged, but when I checked the memory card, I found dozens of images that hadn't been there when it was stolen. Most were shots of the forest from angles and locations I didn't recognize, suggesting the camera had been carried around extensively. But the final images were the most disturbing. They showed my house. Taken from my own front yard during what appeared to be the middle of the night, the photos documented a systematic surveillance of my property. The camera had been used to photograph my truck, my windows, my door, and even the interior of my garage, visible through a side window. The message was unmistakable. They knew where I lived. They had the intelligence and dexterity to operate complex equipment, and they were letting me know that my withdrawal from their territory hadn't ended their interest in me. That night, I heard sounds outside my house that confirmed my worst fears. Heavy footsteps moving around the perimeter of my property, stopping at each window, checking doors, and examining my vehicle. The sounds continued until just before dawn, when they finally faded away. I didn't sleep at all that night. Instead, I sat in my living room with my rifle, listening to evidence that my life had been fundamentally changed by my curiosity about what was living in those remote mountains. The next morning, I made the hardest decision I'd ever made as an outdoorsman. I sold all my hunting equipment, rifles, cameras, camping gear, everything that connected me to the wilderness activities that had defined most of my adult life. I stopped hiking in any forested areas, avoided camping trips, and changed my daily routines to minimize time spent outdoors after dark. It felt like surrender, and in many ways it was. But it also felt like the only rational response to a situation that had spun completely beyond my control or understanding. I'd stumbled into contact with something that operated by rules I didn't know, in territory I'd thought I understood but clearly didn't. For months afterward, I remained vigilant for any signs that my withdrawal hadn't been accepted. I watched for footprints around my property, listened for sounds that didn't belong, and checked my windows each morning for evidence of nighttime visits. Gradually, the signs of surveillance faded away, and I began to hope that my capitulation had satisfied whatever intelligence I'd been dealing with. It's been over a year now since my last definitive encounter, and I've started to feel like I might have successfully extracted myself from a situation that could have ended much worse than it did. But I still don't venture into remote wilderness areas, and I still check my property regularly for signs of visitors I wouldn't welcome. The experience changed my entire understanding of what might be living in the vast wilderness areas that cover so much of this continent. There are places out there, remote, rarely visited places, where things exist that most people would find impossible to believe. And some of those things are intelligent enough to understand when they're being watched and studied. I've never told this story to anyone before, mostly because I know how it sounds. It's the kind of account that gets people labeled as unstable or attention-seeking. But I've also never stopped thinking about what I experienced and what it might mean for other people who venture into areas where they might not be as alone as they think. The mountains are still there, still wild, still home to things that most people never see and never want to see. And somewhere in those remote clearings and hidden valleys, something is watching and waiting and demonstrating a level of intelligence that makes it far more dangerous than any bear or mountain lion. I consider myself lucky to have escaped that situation with nothing more than sleepless nights and a changed perspective on wilderness safety. But I also know that my curiosity almost cost me much more than that, and that there are places in this world where human beings are not the most intelligent or dangerous predators. The trail cameras are gone, the camping trips are over, and the hunting seasons pass without me now. But sometimes, especially on clear nights when the moon is bright enough to illuminate the forest, I still get that feeling like I'm being watched. And when that happens, I go inside, lock the doors, and remind myself that some mysteries are better left unsolved. For more interesting stories, check this out.